I guess someone's taken a little closer look at OS X, and I think we were doing a little bit of a comparative analysis earlier. So, Matt, what can you tell us?
So this is research that came out at RSA. Tons of stuff happened at RSA this past week, but this is one of the ones that I thought was particularly interesting. Patrick Wardle of, I think the team is called SYNAC, did analysis of OS X security features that are relatively recent, and found that most of them aren't really all that great. In particular, he spent time looking at Gatekeeper, which is, I believe it's whether or not you can run things that are from the App Store or outside the App Store, and XProtect, which is the built-in antivirus. Turns out that in Gatekeeper, all it takes to bypass that validation that's done is to find an application that's from the store that loads external modules. In Windows, we would call this DLL hijacking, and the files in OS X are called dylib files, which are dynamic libraries, same thing, different naming scheme, kind of. But do that, and the validation is done on the main file and not on the external, your code will run. In XProtect, apparently, they're still using the old pattern matching, like exact matching. So they'll hash a file and compare it to a known list of hashes.
Right.
So the easy way around that is to modify the file slightly. Apparently, simply compiling it is enough to bypass that check. What weirds me out is they claim that even changing the name of the file is enough to bypass that check. And that shouldn't work, at least not in the Windows world. So I'm wondering what it is about that file name that allows that to happen. Maybe they're including the name in the file hash when they create it for an antivirus.
That's a possibility.
It's strange. It's a little bit weird for me. So there's other features that are mentioned in this presentation. The sandbox, which is a good thing to have in an operating system. Apparently, there's a number of vulnerabilities that were released by Google's Project Zero, which can be used to escape the sandbox. So again, there's a bypass for that. The code signing one is a little bit worrying. Typically, when you have code signing, the whole point is don't run code that isn't correctly signed. In this case, the implementation seems to be see if the code is signed. If the code is signed and not signed in a valid way, don't let it run. If it's signed and valid, let it run. If it's not signed, let it run.
So this is that's actually a classic implementation that I've seen in other places.
Really?
Well, let's take DNSSEC for an example.
Okay.
Do you want to turn off the entire DNS infrastructure because most of it isn't signed?
I see what you mean.
So it's all, so it's actually not an unusual circumstance like that.
So
it becomes one of these, well, what are you really doing? Are you creating security, or are you just creating a perception of security in certain situations that you end up running into?
And it's a backwards compatibility sort of thing.
You have to deal with the world the way it is today.
Yeah.
And so, the fantasy is that you ultimately transition to a point where everything's signed, and then you never have to worry about that other stuff, or you can basically obviate that. But then there are all kinds of other problems you run into as well.
Interesting.
It doesn't. Those are completely different circumstances, but it is an example where the tendency is to say, well, if it's not signed, then you don't have to worry about it.
But everybody has to be on board in order for that plan to work.
Right. Yeah.
So there's a really good slides up on the RSA conference website. Talks about it's sort of a survey of different persistence mechanisms as well as a survey of what current OS X malware is using as its persistence mechanisms. So it's a good read.
Yeah, interesting. All right. Well, I guess so. My question around this: are these really practical issues that we need to be taking a look at? Whether we're using Windows or Mac, or what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are it's probably high time that somebody did take a look at these issues. I feel like a lot of the things that are listed here are the same kinds of attacks we've seen in the Windows space for a long time. I mean, DLL hijacking, everybody's known in the Windows space for a very long time. And they even mentioned at the start of the presentation that the market share for OS X is increasing. And it's probably time that somebody took a look at this. Because some of the mechanisms that are used for persistence are actually, he'll say, here's what they are, and then he'll go down the list and say, and this one's using A, and this one's using B, and this one's using C. So these are all things that should be considered in the near future.
Yeah, and perhaps this really comes down to the attack targets. That is, if you're using, depending on what operating system you're using for your critical applications that might be a target for attack, that may have a significant impact on who is motivated to actually develop an attack around that. And the thing that keeps coming to mind here are point of sale systems, for example. I personally am not aware of any point of sale systems that are using OS X at this point. Mm-hmm. There may be some, but they're not widely proliferated. And I think that's fundamentally perhaps one of the differences that exists, is that as point of sale systems, for example, begin to use other operating systems, they're going to become a more lucrative target to put the effort into developing the.
And we're going to touch on that in just a bit, I think.
Oh, are we going to do that?